Welcome back to the channel. This next build is by far the largest woodworking project that I have ever taken on myself. And I may have slightly underestimated how much time it would take me, but it is just under 9 feet long and just under 4 feet wide. And it is end grain butcher block walnut, the entire top, and then it waterfalls down both sides. There's over 3,000 individual little squares of walnut that make this countertop up, and it is 1.5 inches thick. Turned out fantastic. Took me a heck of a long time to do with the tools that I had at the time, but I would love to show you guys the build process. So that's coming up next, and please stay tuned. So I started the project off with 4/4 rough sawn walnut. So normally with an end grain butcher block cutting board that you'd be doing, the whole lamination and glue ups would all be done in one piece. But that same sort of strategy was not going to work for the size of countertop that I was trying to create. So my strategy going into this was to basically make a whole pile, and by a whole pile I mean like 30 end grain cutting boards, and then basically glue those all together. So through this process, the hardest part was trying to keep all the dimensions for all lumber that I was cutting all the exact same. And so that's kind of the strategy, and throughout the video you'll see different piles of sort of half compiled cutting boards and that sort of thing, and those are all pieces that eventually make up the entire countertop. And so here I'm actually working on the waterfall ends that go down, sort of cascading down both sides of the island. And so these were made in longer pieces, and you can see that I've laminated these pieces sort of vertically, if you will, whereas the countertop pieces, the first lamination would be done with the narrow ends of the boards glued together. So this build I took on just when I was kind of getting my wood shop set up, and so you'll see that a lot of tools that I probably should have for a build this big, I don't. So I don't have a large thickness planer at this point. In the background you can kind of see my 6-inch thickness planer that I did have. Also have a 6-inch jointer, and I've got the guard removed off of that so that I can try to get these wider pieces planed, because it was a lot easier and faster to plane them than it was running them through the single head drum sander that I have here. You'll also notice a horrible lack of dust collection and the use of a shop vac to try to control dust does not work well at all. I have since gotten a new dust collector, and there will be a video on that coming up soon, but that probably is something that I should have had before taking on this project. You can see the amount of dust and stuff that's on the ground throughout this build, and that would have been all but eliminated if I had the proper equipment. But sometimes you got to use what you got. So here I am putting together the first of 2 waterfall ends, and I like to kind of clamp them up initially, just make sure that all the joints are gonna fit nicely. I'm not gonna have any big gaps before applying glue, and realizing after that I've got a joint that I've got to take back to the jointer or otherwise here. So now, because I didn't have a large thickness planer, I was using the drum sander essentially as a thickness planer or a thickness sander. So it got a serious workout. I spent hours and hours and hours putting all of this wood through this thickness sander. Probably wasn't the best use of that equipment, was very slow going, but that was the only means that I really had, as my thickness planer that I did have at the time was only 6 inches wide, and if I had tried to break this project up into 6-inch wide pieces, arguably probably wouldn't have turned out as well there. So here I am, I'm just trimming up the ends of the waterfall sections, And so I've got the smaller, I think it's the T55 Festool track saw, and in retrospect, probably wish that I had gone for the bigger unit. Cutting through 1.5 inches of walnut like this really pushed this saw pretty much to its limits. It was starting to stall out if I went too fast. So here we're getting on to actually making the top of the countertop. So I've got the laminations there, and starting to cut the strips. And then this is basically what it looked like. I had to make about 30 or so pieces that were about this size in the end grain. So it was just basically a large cutting board. And then I trimmed all of these up and was able to glue those together. Of course, not before going back to the drum sander to clean it up. So once I was through getting these sanded down to more or less a final finish, I can go back to the table saw and just trim off the edges and make sure that those are nice and square and true to each other. And I was trying to remove as little amount of the material as possible to try to maintain the pattern and the width and length of each individual square. So now with all of those kind of glued together, I've got wide strips that are about 18 inches to 12 inches wide depending on where they were, and I'm able to sort of do the layout here for what the island was gonna look like. So it's a pretty monumentous occasion in the build, finally getting to look at the whole project and in its full size. And so from here, I took a few of the larger sections and glued those together. Now here I'm using dominoes because I do have everything sort of more or less finished sanded. Everything's to the exact same thickness. So the dominoes is just really helping with the alignment here and making sure that as I glued it up, I was gluing it up completely flat and true. And I wasn't having any kind of elevation differences between each board that I was going to then have to sand down. And that worked really, really well. So I was very glad that I did that to ensure that in these bigger glue ups that the lamination or that the surface finish was really nice. So once the glue had cured here, I was able to sand down those glue lines and just do a little bit of a, more or less final sanding on the pieces here. And then it was time to bring them into the house. And I needed to do this to do some test fitting and also decide where I was going to do the cutouts for the sink. And so here I'm routering out the corners because I wanted some nice radiuses in the corner that would match the sink. And so I was just taking a little cut each time, and then I was able to use my track saw to meet up to where I was routing. And then just putting a little bit of a chamfer on the edge. So now I've got those 3 pieces for the main countertop top section, and I'm using a Domino XL to put in some dominoes to connect those just like I had done previously. So when it was set up in the kitchen, I did mark for those domino positions as well. And that was the big glue up, and now I'm just trimming off the edges to get them flush and true, and then marking for the overall sort of length or a depth of the countertop, and cutting those square as well. Now having a track saw was invaluable throughout this build. Really allowed me to get some really good clean lines, straight lines, and move the saw versus trying to move the workpiece. So I'm not sure how I would have worked with a piece this large without a track saw, to be honest. So I did put some finish on it in the garage. Probably was a little bit of a mistake on my part. Should have held off, but because I did get a little too close to the outside edges where I was going to be gluing on kind of that waterfall piece. And so as a result, my glue joints in that area weren't probably as tight and as good as they could be, because some of the oil did kind of seep around the edge and down, which didn't lend itself to the best glue joint. But I did have dominoes in there, so that held it quite tight, but I know I could have done better. So here's the finished product. So I started by doing these two pieces in the kitchen. I did them with a slightly different process or technique, which I didn't use on the kitchen island after some lessons learned, so maybe there's another video there. But couldn't be happier with how the island turned out. It was a huge undertaking, but I think it turned out fantastic, and please let me know in the comments below, and if you have any questions, please let me know. I try to respond to all the ones that are posted. Thanks.